And this is BizPulse, only on Africa News Network, first fast live. My name is Cindy Mabi. Good evening to you. The new Eskom board, led by Jabu Mabuza as the chairperson, is likely to take over the reins within a week. Mabuza, who currently chairs Telkom, has been credited with its function and financial turnaround in 2012. A lot of expectations ride on the team as the challenges presented by the power utility are enormous. As Eskom struggles to put together its interim results to avoid suspension by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, all eyes are on the incumbent leadership to defuse the impending crisis. Eskom spokesperson Kulu Pasiwe says the new board will keep or help restore investor confidence.
This issue of finding a date for us to release the results, that one is a definite thing that we have to do as a starting point. The other things like improving our liquidity position and also dealing with the issues of corruption, those become part of the things that we have in our in-tray, but some of them will take a bit of time because you can't deal with them overnight. But the most urgent one is to address the concerns that have been made by the JSE.
The country has the highest expectation in the new board to reposition Eskom, tighten its governance systems and traverse a changing energy environment while placing Eskom on a solid financial footing. The board has the full support of government. A special general meeting will soon be scheduled. I've already had several discussions with the new chairperson. Following the audit findings against Eskom, I introduced immediate changes to the significant materiality framework to improve oversight and increase visibility on transactions.
But it's not going to be a rosy path for the new Eskom board, with a slew of challenges ahead. Stability, transparency and effective governance and financial discipline would be top of the agenda. Dwindling finances as Treasury refuses a cash injection and nurses' rejection of the 19.9% tariff hike request, and reviews skewed evergreen and cost-plus contracts, straining Eskom to negotiate additional independent power producers' contracts to reduce financial burden to suit requirements and release interim results by the 31st of January to avoid being delisted from the JSE, and use procurement spend to promote BEE and push for radical economic transformation and to restore the image and credibility amidst multiple controversies and inquiries.
We are doing everything possible to make sure that our bonds remain listed within the JSE. It's very important for us to be on the JSE because once you are there, it gives credence to the market to say that this company is a trusted company. You can deal with them and they are doing things according to the regulations, and therefore you can buy the bonds, you can trust them.
The implications are horrific. It would be serious not just for Eskom, but for the country as a whole, for the national treasury, because Eskom is so big and it's such a big part of the financial sector that really, if a failure of Eskom to attract its own funding would mean calling on government guarantees. If it did that, we were working out that if we look at the moment, government budget deficit to GDP looks like it's running at over 5%, 5 to 5.5%. Now, if Eskom called on those guarantees and said, this is the only way we can keep afloat, government would have to help them out, and what would happen then? Well, according to our calculations, the government budget deficit to GDP would rise to over 11%. At that sort of level, you will not get any funding, any credit from anybody, because that would define the level of our creditworthiness. It would be zero. It would be less than that if that's possible.
And joining us in studio, Tsepo Khadima, political analyst, and Zamo Madlala from the Radical Economic Transformation on Coalition as the Secretary General. Good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us. Khadima, we saw your post on social media, and these are issues that you were complaining about, saying that it is institutionalized almost to render Eskom ineffective and to fail in a sense. What will the new board be able to rectify in that scenario?
Well, I mean, one would have thought or imagined that at least today, I think one thing that Mr. Jabu Mabuza had the duty and the obligation to not do was to go to that jamboree called Davos. And as we sit here tonight, he's in Davos, when he had just been appointed to the most important company in the entire economy and the entire country. And first things first, he was supposed to have been sitting with his board as early as yesterday to have really been able to come out by the close of business today to be able to give a sense of what is his understanding of the issues that the board has to pay attention to and exactly what is it that they are going to do. So yesterday, as you correctly say, that I did write a post which was published on social media. I said, if I had been appointed the chairman of Eskom SOC Limited, I then enumerated the number of interventions that I would lead the board to do. And up till now, I am clearly convinced that there is no other way except to do those things. And what are those things that I mentioned? For example, Eskom needs to be ring-fenced completely from interference by outside special interest groups who are pursuing nothing other than parochial interest. And that might either be the African National Congress, the Democratic Alliance, the oligopolistic cartel of banks and funders that also are pursuing nothing other than parochial interest in the guise of funding for Eskom. So this board needs to guard against that interference and also, of course, receiving unlawful instructions whereby they are being instructed to take certain action without themselves having applied their minds to that. Now, if they were to do that, and that is a message that needs to come out very unambiguous from the office of the chairman of the board, that that's what they're going to do. And what is the next thing? I mean, I listened to Mr. Cruikshanks there speaking about the current debt to GDP ratio that we have, and that if Eskom indeed does default on its bonds, or they are called, those bonds, which are valued at about 350 billion rand, what that would mean in terms of the debt to GDP ratio of the nation. You know, the 11% I think is an overstated number that he mentioned, but needless to say that obviously the financial hardship will be such that effectively you'll have a company that will sink. So what must the board be doing? For example, I cannot see how any board can believe that Eskom can continue to grow and fund the new build program as they have traditionally been doing in terms of bond issuances. And the last board of 2016 issued or gave an approval for issuing bonds to the value of 338 billion rand between 2017 and 2022. So what must they do? They need to re-engineer the capital structure. And if the board of Eskom would not be knowing by now that they need to re-engineer the capital structure, I would be exceedingly worried and horrified. But what they need to do is to completely not follow what has been suggested in one of the daily newspapers, that the power generation unit or the division of Eskom is the one that is a drag. In fact, when the people speak about a balance sheet, that the balance sheet is weak, it clearly shows that perhaps maybe they are not seized with the reality of what needs to be done. And of course, lastly, I want to say that the Independent Power Producers Program is the one that, of course, cost 19.9 billion. The finance costs were 14.8 billion. So effectively, if we didn't have the independent power producers into the mix, if we had them off the income statement of the company, Eskom would not have been in this liquidity crisis and having a risk of insolvency. And that is what we expect of the board. And of course, I can speak of what we expect of management to do. But for me, in my view, this is what they need to do, and revise the covenants. The covenants that had been negotiated on the various bonds, whereby if there is one area where there's a question mark, for example, then it triggers an event of default right across. For the life of me, I cannot understand. The bonds of Eskom should have been AAA rated, therefore meaning causing the least in interest. And yet what we have double security offered by government in terms of the guarantees, but at the same time we've got a double cost in terms of the interest that Eskom pays on that borrowing. That is what the board must do. They must undo that exceedingly
what powers
perilous
do they
situation.
have? Yeah, let's invite Zamo Madlala from the Radical Economic Transformation Coalition. Good evening, Zamo, and thanks for holding. The autonomy that Tsepo is suggesting, we know the vested interest that is in state-owned enterprises, and of course the suggestion that privatization may be the way to go. In your view, do you think that we're leaning towards that? If you look at the instruction of the independent power producers, Tsepo arguing that this is not necessarily what we need right now in the grid, considering the adequate electricity that we're generating. What is your view?
Good evening, Cindy, and the viewers at home, including Mr. Khadim at studio. Well, our opinion as the Radical Economic Transformation Coalition is really quite simple. We like the balance of the new board. It is represented by 6 females, so you almost have the 50% split. And then also when you look at the qualifications within, we find there's a nuclear physicist on the board, there's an economist, there are people that have got an engineering background, and you do have Ms. Makuvane on it, who is a senior engineer, has been the DG within the energy department for some time. So I would agree with Mr. Khadima in terms of the independent power producers. We really need to get to a point where we really take a decision between nuclear versus renewable energy. I think there are numerous public reports that have shown that this whole renewable energy technology, which is being punted and being pushed on us within South Africa, has failed in Europe and countries like Germany, etc. And it's been proved that it's actually not that beneficial. Perhaps right now it may not be the right time to be looking at a nuclear build program, but I certainly would agree with Tsepo that it's certainly nonsensical to say you're going to take generation away from Eskom, because you are then literally weakening the balance sheet, because there would be no asset to maintain on the balance sheet. I also believe that the appointment of Jabu Mabuza as the chair of BUSA, I know that we constantly look at him as the chairman of Telkom, but he is also the chair of BUSA. Within BUSA, you've got the banking sector, who came last year in October, and they said they will no longer be able to fund Eskom because of governance issues and all of that. We trust that now that they have their man at the helm, he ought to be able to negotiate that these private banks are able to come to the aid of Eskom to allow for the restructuring as Mr. Khadima is proposing. But the idea of privatization is just not the way to go, because you cannot privatize what literally keeps the country going, because private interests do one thing: maximize profit. So you will find that these 19.9% requests and things like that, you will find our electricity costs becoming exorbitant.
Zama, just hold on. Yeah, let's take it bite sizes at a time. Obviously, they'll have to deal with reputational damages and stability and the public perception. Take the public into its confidence, this new leadership, and deal with allegations of systemic looting, primarily around the Gupta leaks and linked companies. That would obviously take away the focus in reviewing the long-standing evergreen contracts that are just perpetuated and repeated without even a whim.
And Cindy, one of the most astonishing things and the absurdities that is being peddled in the mainstream media on a daily basis is, of course, that, Eskom, of the 82 billion rand, the 600 million rand contract that is there, or 400 million a year, is the one that at the end of the day is the cause of financial loss, and that is the Tegeta contract. And of course, that is absolutely nonsensical, and I challenge anyone in this country to come here and debate that, but they will not do so because they know that they will be embarrassed in front of the nation. It's an absurdity. If you have the independent power producers supply only 5% of the electricity sold by Eskom, but they cost 25%. So if you have a 25% cost for only 5% of what you are able to sell out there, that already, I cannot see how anyone can really look South Africans in the eye and totally not make any mention whatsoever on what they are going to do with the IPPs, which, by the way, this past financial year were 19.8 billion rand. The current financial year, ending March, the figure will have gone substantially higher. It will effectively stabilize at about 35 billion rand a year. So that's the one point that I'm making. On the other hand, the issue of Exxaro. Exxaro to this day still has a contract that the circumstances under which it was signed, nobody wants to address that, whereby they have already been paid over 8.7 billion rand and yet never delivered one wheelbarrow of coal for that 8.7 billion rand. Now, I cannot see how anyone in government can actually be wanting to turn a blind eye on this egregious colossal looting, if we can put it that way. So those are the things that I think that the new board, there should be no holy cows. For whatever reason, the independent power producers renewables are a holy cow. We have found that ministers have been wanting to do absurdities of insisting that Eskom should sign additional independent power producer power purchase agreements to add more financial woes on Eskom. So what I'm saying is this board, by today, they should have, and if they haven't, in the next day or two, they need to tell the nation what they're going to do. But the solution and the answer is not the breakup of Eskom, as some others would have wanted. For example, if you break up Eskom, South Africans, I encourage them to do this. Everywhere else where they drive, let them just look at any power line that they see running. They will see that there's a servitude of anywhere between 15 and 35 meters. So it means, therefore, if you were to now take out that transmission line, take it out, you are not only selling the transmission line, you are also selling, it will be the biggest land sale for nothing in the history of this country to a greedy profiteering privateer. How can we allow such a situation? Now, Quebec, let's talk about Quebec, for example. It's a power station in Cape Town, 1,900 megawatts in terms of capacity. That power station, when I'm talking about the balance sheet, or rather the capital structure re-engineering, through a capital structure re-engineering, Quebec alone would bring on board over 6 billion euros in value. Now, whatever the exchange rate is, the viewers, they can do their own calculation. But 6 billion euros in value will come onto the balance sheet, therefore fundamentally change the financial status of this corporation. And management, of course, there are a number of other things that they can do. For example, the Eskom boilers, they are running at higher temperatures, therefore their boilers are getting damaged, and they are buying emergency power, which is increasing the cost. Hence, even in December, one of the things that happened, in 3 hours, they spent 56 million rand running the open combined gas turbines to only generate electricity for 3 hours at the cost of 56 million rand.
Yeah, so I understand that it's a very technically specialized area, Tsepo, but I think just to, it is early days, to give the new board a benefit of the doubt, that indeed the suggestions that you're making and the expertise that they possess,
there is no honeymoon.
That, you know, will be back on track. That the honeymoon is short-lived.
They took the job knowing full well there is no time for honeymoon. They needed to have gotten started, and I'm saying I'm taking umbrage at the fact that some of the board members are in Davos, when at the end of the day, their trip in Davos, I cannot see how it will bring any value, except that maybe they are hoping some bankers will say, well, we will fund you because we like you in the snow.
So we're going to leave it there. That's Tsepo Khadima, political and economic analyst. Samu Madlala, Radical Economic Transformation on Coalition Secretary General, joining us on reflecting on the new board at Eskom and the challenges that they face.